Welcome to the Deep Dive. We're the show that really tries to cut through the noise and get straight to the core of some complex global issues.
That's the plan.
Today, we're plunging into a topic that has, well, profoundly reshaped international politics since the Cold War ended. We're talking about human rights and the really thorny dilemmas around humanitarian intervention.
It's a huge one.
Yeah, for centuries,
All this.
global affairs were largely, a game of power and security between states. Individual people, they weren't really part of the equation.
Not explicitly, no.
But in a really surprising shift, these moral questions, especially about human rights, are now standing shoulder to shoulder with those traditional concerns.
And it creates this intense tension.
Exactly. And its real-world implications are, frankly, often quite heartbreaking when you look at them. So our mission today, as always, is to take a stack of sources on this human rights, humanitarian intervention, and distill the most crucial insights, give you a shortcut to understanding this incredibly complex, always evolving area.
And I think you'll find this topic is absolutely brimming with those aha moments, isn't it? As we dig in, you'll uncover some, well, surprising facts about how the very idea of human rights developed.
Right.
And how it fundamentally challenges that long-held notion of state sovereignty. Our goal here is to help you cut through all the noise, understand the core arguments, and really grasp what truly matters in this vital debate.
Okay, so what are we actually going to unpack today? We'll kick things off by defining what human rights even are and, where did they come from?
The origin story.
Exactly. Then we'll explore how they're supposedly protected internationally and, crucially, what the limitations are. Because there's definitely are limitations.
Oh, absolutely.
We'll dive headfirst into those fierce debates around universality. That's where so much of the controversy lies, right?
It's a major fault line, yeah.
And finally, we'll tackle the complex, often really controversial practice of humanitarian intervention. We'll be asking whether and when intervening in another state's affairs can ever truly be justified.
A massive question.
Okay, let's unpack this by laying some groundwork first. For a long, long time, international politics was primarily understood as, well, a realm of collective groups,
Yeah.
states, empires, alliances, that sort of thing.
The big players.
Yeah. The individual needs, the interests of actual people, were largely just swallowed up within this bigger idea of the national interest.
Mm-hmm.
It essentially meant global politics boiled down to a struggle for power among states, with very little thought given to the well-being or happiness or, the suffering of individuals.
People and therefore morality were almost entirely factored out of the picture. It was about power, pure and simple, or at least that was the dominant view.
Yeah, and what's really interesting here is how that separation, that divorce between state policy and the individual, this split between power and morality, and it became increasingly difficult to maintain.
It just couldn't hold forever. Over time, the sheer scale of human suffering and the growing recognition of individual dignity began to chip away at that traditional, very state-centric view.
And that really set the stage, didn't it, for the rise of human rights as this, well, compelling force in international affairs.
Absolutely.
So when we talk about human rights, what are we actually defining? What's the core idea?
Okay, at their heart, human rights are entitlements. Things people possess simply because they are human. That's the baseline.
Right, like a modern secular version of what people used to call natural rights.
Precisely. And these rights, they have 4 key characteristics that are really crucial to understand. First, they are universal.
Meaning everywhere, everyone.
Exactly. They belong to human beings everywhere. It doesn't matter about race, religion, gender, any of those differences. Second, they are fundamental.
Can't be taken away.
Cannot be removed. They are inalienable. Third, they are indivisible. This one's critical.
Why is that?
Because it means civil and political rights, things like freedom of speech, are interconnected with, and just as important as economic, social, and cultural rights, like the right to education or healthcare. You can't just pick and choose.
They're all part of the package.
They're co-equal in importance, yeah. And finally, they are absolute. They represent the basic grounds for living a genuinely human life, and they can't really be qualified or compromised away.
Okay, so the key takeaway here isn't just a list of things people should have. It's that these rights represent a fundamental, unremovable challenge to traditional ideas of power wherever you are.
That's it, exactly. It's a challenge to unaccountable power.
Which makes you think about the history, the roots of these ideas. I mean, lots of cultures, civilizations throughout history, they had concepts about the intrinsic worth of individuals, right?
Yeah, for sure. But traditionally, these were often deeply tied to religious belief. The idea that humans were, say, creatures of God and their moral worth came from that divine authority.
So how did that evolve into the secular idea we have now?
Well, the prototype for our modern idea of human rights really came out of early modern Europe. It took the form of natural rights.
Ah, the philosophers.
Right. Political thinkers like Hugo Grotius, Thomas Hobbes, John Locke, they conceptualized these rights as natural because they were thought to be God-given, inherent to human nature itself.
Not just moral claims, but something deeper.
Yeah, they were seen as reflecting the most fundamental inner human drives, the basic conditions for leading a truly human existence. Inalienable.
And by the late 18th century, these ideas had clearly sort of morphed into the rights of man. Later, thankfully extended to women, too.
A crucial extension.
And this concept was explicitly used to limit government power, wasn't it? To define the sphere of autonomy that belonged to the citizen, not the state.
Exactly. You see it powerfully in the U.S. Declaration of Independence, 1776. Life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness as inalienable rights.
Famous.
And of course, the French Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen in 1789 echoed those same kinds of sentiments. Big historical moments.
What's also important, though, is how these ideas gradually picked up an international dimension, right? Through the 19th and early 20th centuries.
Yeah, that's a key point. It wasn't like a switch was flipped. It was more of a piecemeal process, driven by what you could call humanitarian ethics, this growing concern for well-being of humanity as a whole, beyond borders.
Right. And we see this in specific examples, like the movement to abolish the slave trade. That was huge.
Absolutely. Endorsed way back at the Congress of Vienna in 1815, eventually outlawed by the Slavery Convention in 1926.
And that anti-slavery society formed in 1837. You could argue that was maybe the world's first human rights NGO.
Quite possibly. Other efforts included trying to regulate warfare. The Hague and Geneva Conventions come to mind.
And improving working conditions. The International Labor Organization, 1919.
All pieces of the puzzle. But, and this is important, these developments, while significant, they were still pretty marginal, quite piecemeal, until after the Second World War.
Ah, the big turning point.
The war, and especially the profound horrors of the final solution. The systematic murder of some 6 million Jews, Roma, Slavs, others in Nazi extermination camps, that had a truly catalytic impact on global thinking.
The sheer scale of it.
It made it undeniable. States simply could not be left unchecked within their own borders. Something had to change at the international level.
And that leads us straight to the landmark moment. The UN General Assembly's Universal Declaration of Human Rights in 1948.
UDHR foundational.
It wasn't just a statement, was it? It outlined this comprehensive code for how UN member states should govern themselves internally. And it's widely seen now as having the status of customary international law.
Even though it wasn't a treaty initially.
Right. And it was later supplemented by those two crucial treaties in 1966. The International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights and the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights.
Together, they're often called the International Bill of Human Rights.
So what's the real significance of 1948 then, in the grand scheme of things?
What's truly significant is that 1948 arguably marked an end to 300 years of unchallenged state sovereignty, this idea that had dominated international politics since the Treaty of Westphalia in 1648.
So the Declaration set up human rights as a rival idea to sovereignty.
As a rival norm, exactly. But, and this is vital to understand, while a rival norm was established, those inherent tensions, the conflict between states' rights and human rights, they were by no means fully resolved in 48.
No, that tension is still very much with us.
It absolutely continues to shape global politics today.
That ongoing tension probably explains why the content of human rights has kept evolving. There's this idea of generations of rights, right? Introduced by Karol Vasek in 1977.
Yes, the generations framework is a useful way to understand how the scope of what we consider human rights has expanded over time. It helps map the evolution.
So what's the first generation?
Okay, first generation rights are the civil and political rights. They're often associated with the core theme of liberty. These are the earliest forms, the ones advanced through big historical moments like the English, French, and American revolutions.
These are the ones people often think of first, yeah. Rights to life, liberty, property.
Those core ones, yes. But they've expanded to include really critical freedoms like freedom from discrimination, from slavery, from torture, arbitrary arrest.
And the basic liberties, speech, press, religion, movement, association.
Exactly. Now, there's often a distinction made here.
Between negative and positive rights.
Yes. These first-generation rights are frequently seen as negative rights or forbearance rights. The idea is you enjoy them because others, especially the government, refrain from interfering. They define a private sphere free from encroachment, like freedom of speech.
But it's not always that simple, is it?
It's misleading to say they're purely negative. Take the right to non-discrimination. That requires positive action from the state legislation enforcement.
Right. Or a fair trial, you need police, courts.
Exactly. So while many grant freedoms from interference, quite a few also require active state measures. That leads to the distinction people sometimes make between civil liberties and civil rights.
Okay, moving on. The second generation. This is about economic, social, and cultural rights with equality as the core theme.
That's right. These gained much more prominence in the 20th century, especially after 1945.
And their emergence is tied to socialism.
Deeply connected, yes, to socialist assumptions about the injustices and inequalities inherent in capitalist development. These socioeconomic rights, things like the right to Social Security, the right to work, paid holidays, healthcare, education.
Things that require the state to do something.
Precisely. They were explicitly designed to counterbalance the inequalities of market capitalism, aiming to protect working classes, colonial peoples from exploitation.
And unlike many first-generation rights, these are pretty clearly positive rights. They imply a significant level of state intervention, welfare, labor market regulation, economic management.
Which is where the deep controversy really kicks in.
Yeah, tell me about that.
Well, supporters argue that these rights are, in a fundamental sense, the most basic human rights. Why? Because their fulfillment is a precondition for enjoying any other rights.
You can't really exercise free speech if you're starving or have no education.
Exactly. From this perspective, human dignity is far more severely threatened by poverty, disease, lack of education than by the denial of, say, liberal civil rights.
But there's strong opposition, especially from some Western states.
Oh, yes. Particularly in the USA and other Western states, these economic and social rights have often been dismissed. At best, second-class human rights. At worst, entirely bogus moral claims.
What are the main criticisms?
Critics raise several points. First, they argue that maintaining these rights requires resources and political capabilities that many states simply don't have, so they become aspirations, not actual entitlements.
Who pays for them?
That's the second point. There's ambiguity about responsibility. If a national government lacks the resources, do obligations fall on other states, international organizations? It's unclear.
And the third point, related to economics.
Right. From an economic liberalism viewpoint, some argue these rights might even be counterproductive. They could lead to excessive state intervention that undermines the vigor and efficiency of capitalist economies. Big debates there.
Okay, then we get to the third generation. Solidarity rights focusing on fraternity.
Yes. These emerged largely after 1945, heavily influenced by concerns coming out of the Global South. Their main feature is that they're attached to social groups or whole societies, not just individuals.
Collective rights, sometimes called, or people's rights.
Exactly. The right to self-determination, for instance, became inextricably linked to decolonization after 1945, the rise of national liberation movements.
What else falls into this category?
Other key rights include the right to development, the right to peace, the right to environmental protection, and multicultural rights. Essentially, these solidarity rights give issues like development and environmental sustainability a crucial moral dimension.
But they face criticism too.
They do. Critics point to their inherent vagueness. And more fundamentally, they question whether human rights can actually belong to groups or peoples as opposed to individuals.
Why is that a problem?
Because the very idea of human rights is arguably based on a model of individual self-worth. That model is potentially weakened whenever people are thought of primarily in terms of their group membership. It shifts the focus.
Let's make this more concrete. Indigenous rights are a powerful example of a third-generation collective right, aren't they?
Absolutely. And their story really highlights some of these tensions. When the UN's original human rights model was set up, think the Charter in 45, the UDHR in 48, it was very much rooted in the vision of the Western nation-states driving the process.
Which meant indigenous rights were
largely ignored. Colonialism was still a major force, and the focus was on the rights of individuals within existing or newly forming states, not necessarily distinct peoples with prior claims.
So when did that start to change?
What's truly critical is how the urgency for indigenous rights really ramped up from the late 20th century, largely driven by decolonization. And this urgency was often directly linked to, well, existential threats.
Like what?
Take the Amazon basin. Indigenous peoples living in the rainforest faced and still face increasing threats from deforestation, much of it clearing land for cattle farming, driven by the global demand for meat.
Their whole way of life, their environment under threat.
Exactly. This led to the formation of crucial NGOs like Survival International, founded back in 1969, specifically fighting for the rights of tribal peoples worldwide.
And eventually the UN itself caught up.
Yes, significantly, the UN adopted the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, UNDY-RIPE, through a General Assembly vote in 2007.
What does UNDRA actually say?
It explicitly recognizes the urgent need to respect and promote the inherent rights of indigenous peoples, with a particular focus on their rights to their lands, territories, and resources. That land rights piece is huge.
Now, I remember there was some controversy around its adoption, wasn't there? A real test of its effectiveness from the start.
You're right. While many states, including Brazil and other global south countries with large indigenous populations, voted for UNGRA, there were initially 4 countries that voted against it:
Who were they?
Australia, Canada, New Zealand, and the United States.
The major English-speaking settler colonial states.
Precisely. These states, whose very foundations involved the mass displacement and often death of indigenous populations, initially saw the Declaration's provisions, especially on land rights, as a potential threat to their territorial integrity.
But they eventually came around.
They did. By 2010, all 4 had reversed their position and endorsed the Declaration.
Okay, so broad endorsement now. But how effective has UNERP actually been?
That's the million-dollar question, and sadly the answer is questionable. Indigenous people in many countries still suffer from really unequal access to social goods, major disadvantages in health, education, income.
And the threats haven't gone away, especially regarding land and resources.
Far from it. In places where indigenous peoples occupy lands or possess resources that are economically valuable, they frequently face threats, displacement, even murder, often from extractivist mining and logging corporations.
You mentioned Brazil earlier.
Stark example. The Articulation of Indigenous Peoples of Brazil, APIB, took the unprecedented step in 2021 of submitting a statement to the International Criminal Court, accusing the former president, Jair Bolsonaro, of genocide.
Genocide. Based on what?
Based on his policies that enabled, even encouraged, greater deforestation in the Amazon, directly threatening indigenous communities. It really shows how far there is still to go, despite the declaration.
Wow. Okay, so given all this, it's clear human rights have these profound implications, but also face huge challenges.
Right.
Let's talk about the international regime that's supposed to protect them.
Right. Since 1948, a truly elaborate system has developed. At its heart still is the UN Universal Declaration. It built on the UN Charter's promise to promote universal respect for human rights by actually specifying what rights states had to guarantee.
And even though the declaration wasn't strictly legally binding,
It's commonly seen as customary international law. It's a crucial tool for applying diplomatic and moral pressure on governments that violate it.
how did it change things fundamentally?
By establishing that states couldn't just violate rights internally without their actions potentially landing on the UN's agenda, it fundamentally challenged states' exclusive jurisdiction over their citizens and weakened that old principle of non-interference.
So it pushed towards implementation, especially after the 1960s.
Exactly. A major step was creating the Office of the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, the OHCHR, in 1993.
What's their role? Enforcement.
Well, their stated role is promoting worldwide respect for human rights. In reality, it's proved more effective at highlighting violations than truly enforcing the law.
Naming and shaming, basically.
That's its main sanction, yeah. Publication, denunciation of violations. It relies heavily on persuasion and observation to nudge governments towards better policies.
And the Human Rights Council. That replaced the old commission in 2006.
Yes, the 47-member council also addresses violations. But it has its own limitations.
Such as?
It has no real authority beyond making recommendations to the General Assembly, which in turn can only advise the Security Council. And like the old commission, it's been criticized for bias and inconsistency.
How so?
It often includes states with pretty dubious human rights records themselves. Member states tend to protect each other, especially developing states shielding each other from criticism. And there have been persistent allegations of it focusing disproportionately on violations by Israel, creating a perception of imbalance.
Still, despite all these challenges, if you look at the timeline, 1948 UDHR, 1949 Geneva Conventions, 1966 Covenants, 2007 UNDRP, it's hard to deny that significant norm setting has occurred.
Absolutely. The framework exists, even if enforcement is patchy.
Now, one of the really defining features of this whole human rights regime is the incredibly prominent role played by NGOs, non-governmental organizations.
Huge players. Absolutely central.
We're talking vast numbers, right? Over 1,500 NGOs were at the World Conference on Human Rights in Vienna in 1993. By 2018, estimates suggested maybe 300,000 smaller international NGOs, many focused on human rights or humanitarian work.
And we can sort of group them. There are operational NGOs, think the Red Cross, ICRC, Médecins Sans Frontières, MSF, Oxfam. They work directly in the field, relieving suffering.
But they do advocacy too.
They do. They campaign on behalf of the people they treat, pushing for observance of human rights treaties and humanitarian law. Then you have the prominent advocacy NGOs like Human Rights Watch and, of course, Amnesty International.
How do they exert pressure?
Primarily by getting media coverage, leveraging the high moral purpose people tend to attach to their work. They shine a spotlight.
So NGOs have made a substantial contribution to this global human rights culture.
Definitely. They influence governments, even transnational corporations, on things like pay and working conditions overseas. Their impact goes far.
How? Is it just public pressure?
Often it's behind-the-scenes lobbying of government delegations, experts, sometimes even drafting resolutions. For example, an amnesty campaign helped kickstart the process that led to the 1975 Declaration on Torture.
Any other examples?
NGOs were very involved in drafting the 1990 Convention on the Rights of the Child and hugely influential in setting up the Landmine Treaty of 1997. Their fingerprints are on a lot of key documents.
Let's zoom in on one of the biggest. Amnesty International AI. What's their core mission?
Okay, Amnesty. Their main focus is drawing attention to human rights abuses and campaigning for compliance with international standards. They place a special emphasis on the rights of political prisoners, what they famously call prisoners of conscience.
So they mainly target governments.
Primarily, aiming to free those prisoners, ensure fair trials, eliminate torture and the death penalty, and bring abusers to justice. That's the core mandate.
And their main tools, their weapons.
Publicity, education, and political pressure. They typically highlight individual cases. Amnesty staff interview victims, they encourage members to adopt cases, engage in massive letter-writing campaigns.
And publish detailed reports.
Exactly. Those reports are key. All supported by broader campaigns on big issues, terrorism and security, human rights in China, refugees, arms control, violence against women. And since the 70s, they have increasingly been involved in proposing and drafting human rights legislation, too.
They're widely seen as a dominant force, aren't they?
Oh, absolutely. Often considered the single dominant force in human rights advocacy, sometimes seen as more influential than many other groups combined. They even got the Nobel Peace Prize back in 1977.
What are their main strengths?
A global public profile, a long history, broad name recognition. Their reputation is really bolstered by their emphasis on painstaking investigations and impartial report writing. That credibility is crucial.
In focusing mainly on political prisoners. That helps.
Their self-imposed limited mandate has advantages, yes. By concentrating efforts, they've built remarkable consensus about the justice of their cause and provided real assistance to countless victims. It gives them a clear purpose and, through success in individual cases, a frequent sense of achievement for their members. Keeps motivation high.
But they face criticism too. What are the main complaints?
Two main grounds. First, there's their self-acknowledged tendency to focus disproportionately on abuses in more democratic and open countries.
Meaning they give less attention to some of the world's worst violators.
That's the criticism. They've been condemned for it. Amnesty's justification is that they focus public pressure where it's most likely to actually make a difference.
And they want to show they scrutinize the North, too.
Right, to build credibility and influence in the global South by ensuring abuses in the North also get attention. It's a balancing act.
What's the second main criticism?
Accusations of ideological bias. Amnesty has been accused by all sorts of states: China, Russia, South Korea, the DRC. The U.S. has criticized them over the death penalty in Guantanamo Bay. Even the Catholic Church disagrees with their stance on abortion. They get it from all sides.
And there were internal issues recently.
Yes, that's made things more difficult. An independent review in 2019 found Amnesty's work culture to be, quote, toxic with bullying and victimization. That, plus mass redundancies announced the same year. It really jeopardizes their mission.
How so?
Because opponents can seize on these internal issues to undercut their advocacy around the world. It gives ammunition to those who want to discredit their vital work, a powerful, sobering reminder that even respected advocates aren't immune.
Okay, so we've looked at the UN, NGOs.
Right.
But let's face the big one, states.
Yeah.
You mentioned the paradox earlier.
The core dilemma, yeah. States are the only actors powerful enough to really advance human rights on a grand scale, but they are also, often, the greatest human rights abusers. It's an inherent tension between human rights and traditional foreign policy.
But you also said the idea of this unavoidable antagonism is a bit misleading.
It is, I think. Firstly, states were establishing civil liberties and rights in their own domestic law long before the international human rights regime even existed. Think Magna Carta, Bill of Rights.
Right, it wasn't all top-down from the UN.
Not at all. And secondly, international human rights standards weren't just foisted on reluctant states. They were largely created by states themselves, particularly the U.S. and other Western states after 1945, later joined by post-communist and developing states.
So the greater effectiveness of human rights protection in Europe, for example.
Is largely down to the high degree of consensus among European states about their importance. The European Convention on Human Rights, the Court, that's the most advanced example of human rights hard law, with high compliance rates, over 90%. State buy-in makes a difference.
So why have states accepted and sometimes even championed human rights internationally? Pretty much all states signed the UN Declaration, most signed the covenants.
Well, from a liberal perspective, supporting international human rights is just an external expression of values fundamental to liberal democratic states. The idea that foreign policy can and should have a moral purpose, aligning national interests with promoting freedom and democracy globally.
Is there a more pragmatic reason, too?
Definitely. Since 1948, supporting human rights rhetoric, signing the conventions, has become kind of a precondition for full membership in the international community. It brings diplomatic, trade, even security benefits.
So it helps transform the international system into more of a society with shared norms.
Exactly. But this also frequently allows for a pretty significant gulf between a state's stated support for international standards and its actual behavior, either towards its own citizens or other states. The rhetoric-reality gap.
And sometimes states might even use the human rights agenda cynically.
That's the realist argument. Behind the cloak of humanitarianism, human rights often get entangled with national interest calculations. This leads to the selective application of human rights.
Meaning you call out your enemies but ignore your friends.
Precisely. Human rights failings by adversaries get prominent attention, but they're conveniently ignored when committed by allies or states you need something from.
You mentioned the U.S. in the 70s as an example.
A classic one from the sources, yeah. Condemning Soviet bloc violations while maintaining close ties with repressive regimes in Latin America and elsewhere. Radical critics like Noam Chomsky have argued the U.S. has used human rights simply as a moral cloak for its hegemonic ambitions.
So if we judge the success of international human rights by whether they've actually improved state behavior, prevented barbarism, the record is often unimpressive.
It can seem that way. When they conflict, state sovereignty usually trumps human rights, especially for powerful states who can often shrug off criticism or whose transgressions aren't forcefully exposed by other governments, afraid of damaging relations or economic interests.
Like the Soviet Union. Did condemnation really affect them?
There's little evidence it truly did. It didn't stop the invasions of Hungary in '56, Czechoslovakia in '68, Afghanistan in '79, or Russia's brutal suppression of Chechnya in the 1990s. Powerful states often act with impunity.
But you mentioned a subtle impact.
Yes, what's often overlooked is that human rights activism, both inside and outside the Soviet bloc, may have subtly contributed to the eventual collapse of those East European communist regimes.
Oh.
By fostering a growing appetite for political freedom, undermining the regime's legitimacy, fueling the popular protests that swept across Eastern Europe in 1989. It wasn't the only factor, of course, but it played a role.
And Gorbachev even used human rights rhetoric.
He did. Mikhail Gorbachev used it to justify his reforms, perestroika and glasnost, and to realign Soviet relations with the world. He argued human rights were principles that transcended the Cold War divide. Quite a shift.
Let's shift to another powerful state, China. A frequent target of human rights criticism since Tiananmen Square in '89.
Yes. Controversies there have focused on suppressing political dissent, widespread use of capital punishment, treatment of religious minorities like Falun Gong, the situation in Xinjiang with the Uyghurs, and the occupation of Tibet, the subjugation of Tibetan culture. A long list.
And China's economic rise hasn't led to political reform in this area.
That's what's concerning to many observers. If anything, China seems to have become more uncompromising on human rights issues, perhaps as an expression of growing national assertiveness, and also maybe to contain pressures unleashed by economic reform itself.
And as China's become more powerful economically.
Condemnation from other governments has become increasingly muted. Economic interests often seem to outweigh human rights concerns when dealing with Beijing.
Okay, turning back to the U.S., its own commitment was seriously questioned after 9/11 during the War on Terror.
Absolutely. Things like Guantanamo Bay, extraordinary rendition, enhanced interrogation, these practices created a deep sense of disillusionment for many.
Why was that particularly damaging?
Because for many, it marked a break from that post-Cold War period where the acceptance of human rights norms seemed almost irresistible. If the very state largely responsible for constructing the post-1948 human rights regime appeared to violate them so clearly, what hope was there for other states? It damaged U.S. credibility significantly.
And upholding rights in conflict situations has been particularly hard.
Extremely difficult. This often reflects the power politics among the Security Council's permanent members, which frequently prevents the UN from taking a clear, decisive line. The world has often seemed to just stand by as gross violations occurred.
Like Rwanda in '94?
Tragically, yes, about 800,000 mostly Tutsis killed in the genocide.
And Srebrenica in '95.
Massacre there, an estimated 8,000 Bosnian Muslim men and boys murdered. These failures weigh heavily on the international conscience.
But there has been a push for accountability since the '90s.
Yes, there's been a greater emphasis on extending international law to ensure those responsible for gross breaches, genocide, crimes against humanity, war crimes are brought to account. This led to the ad hoc international criminal tribunals and eventually the establishment of the Permanent International Criminal Court, the ICC.
That push for accountability brings us to a fundamental battle within the human rights landscape, the challenge to universalism. Despite its growing prominence, human rights doctrine has come under increasing pressure, especially since the '70s.
Right. And the main attack has been against the universalist assumptions underpinning human rights. It's created this fierce debate between universalism and relativism. Is there one standard for everyone, or does it depend?
Where does this challenge come from?
Two main directions. First, there's a philosophical backlash from within the West itself, communitarianism, for instance.
What's their critique?
They critique liberalism's view of the individual as this sort of atomized, unencumbered self. They argue the self is deeply embedded in the community.
Like a puzzle piece needing the whole puzzle.
Exactly. Liberalism sees the piece alone. Communitarianism says its identity only makes sense as part of the bigger picture. This implies that universal theories of rights must give way to those that are strictly local and particular. An individual's experiences, beliefs, they can't be separated from the social context that gives them meaning.
And postmodernism. Similar conclusions.
Similar conclusions, different path. Postmodernism emphasizes the fragmented, pluralistic nature of reality. It questions the very idea of objective truths and universal values. Jean-François Lyotard famously called postmodernism an incredulity towards meta-narratives.
So grand theories like universal human rights
Must either be abandoned altogether or used only in a strictly qualified way that acknowledges the specific political and cultural context they came from. They aren't seen as universally true.
So that's the Western philosophical critique. What about post-colonial critiques? Are they more political?
Much more overtly political, yes. Post-colonial thinkers defend relativism on two key grounds. Firstly, echoing those Western critiques, they argue societies and cultures vary so widely they simply require different moral values and ideas about human rights. Outsiders should respect the choices made by individual nation-states.
Okay, and the second ground?
This is more radical. They portray universal values, especially human rights, as a form of cultural imperialism.
How so?
They see it as a moral justification for the global imposition of a Western-dominated world order. Using human rights language to justify wars like the wars on terror in Afghanistan and Iraq, or even Cold War conflicts like Korea and Vietnam, is deeply problematic from this perspective.
Why problematic specifically? Three main reasons.
Exactly. First, while universality is proclaimed, the specific rights in the UDHR and other documents were heavily shaped by powerful Western states. They're culturally Eurocentric in their philosophical basis.
Second, The divine status.
Right. The almost sacrosanct status given to human rights, which arguably has Christian theological roots in Western thought, allows states to carry out horrifying acts in their defense. You can bomb a population, kill thousands, yet justify it as freeing them from tyranny. It becomes a dangerous justification.
And third, the link to the global color line.
Yes. The way human rights informs the justification for war in practice has often mapped closely onto this global color line. You see majority white Western states intervening militarily to allegedly protect populations of color in the global South.
So it looks like a modern version of colonial power dynamics.
From a post-colonial perspective, yes. The use of force under the banner of human rights can be seen as a contemporary rearticulation of Western colonial-era power over its former possessions, a very sharp critique.
Beyond these big philosophical and post-colonial critiques, there are specific regional ones too, like Asian values.
Yes, the Asian values debate emerged, emphasizing rival values like social harmony, respect for authority, and a strong belief in the family. These are presented as sustaining social cohesion and directly challenging the Western bias towards rights over duties, the individual over the community.
And this often leads to prioritizing economic and social rights.
Exactly. Prioritizing those second-generation rights over first-generation civil and political ones. The Bangkok Declaration of 1993 tried to balance Asian cultural distinctiveness with the interdependence of rights. And China often responds to criticism by highlighting its success in poverty alleviation, arguing collective socioeconomic rights are more important.
What about Islamic reservations?
Those have been clear since Saudi Arabia refused to adopt the UN Declaration back in '48. They argued it violated important Islamic principles, like its rejection of apostasy.
So the argument is that rights come from divine authority.
Yes. The Cairo Declaration on Human Rights in Islam from 1990 states that rights and all moral principles derive from divine authority, specifically Sharia law, not human authority. This means the UDHR, or any human laws, are invalid if they conflict with Sharia. In principle, human laws should derive from Sharia.
So universal human rights are seen as a Western cultural expression.
Right. A cultural expression of the political and economic domination the West has historically exerted over the Muslim world. Many concerns echo the Asian values debate, worries about Western secularism, excessive individualism threatening traditional values. The West is seen as potentially morally decadent, and human rights risk imposing that decadence elsewhere.
But you said the Islamic critique isn't just relativism.
That's a key distinction. It presents an alternative universalism, because Islam, like liberalism, contains supposedly universal codes applicable to all cultures. It's a different path to universality, not a rejection of the concept itself.
Okay, all these challenges, philosophical, post-colonial, regional, they really come to a head when we talk about humanitarian intervention, don't they? The ultimate test.
Absolutely, because traditionally, the whole state system rejected intervention. International law was built around respect for state sovereignty, inviolable borders.
But the idea that intervention might be okay on humanitarian grounds isn't entirely new.
Not entirely. Early theorists like Vittoria and Grotius acknowledged a right to intervene if a state was severely maltreating its own subjects. They were, in effect, early theorists of humanitarian intervention.
Any historical examples, even if rare?
Well, the Battle of Navarino Bay in 1827, British and French forces helping Greece against the Ottomans. Post-1945, India's intervention in Bangladesh in 1971. Vietnam's in Cambodia in 1978, overthrowing Pol Pot's Khmer Rouge.
But they weren't called humanitarian intervention back then.
Crucially, no. India and Vietnam justified their actions purely in terms of national interest, regional stability. The modern concept of humanitarian intervention is really a post-Cold War creation tied to those optimistic New World Order hopes.
So how do we define this modern idea, given it's so contested and subjective?
At its core, it's military intervention carried out primarily for humanitarian reasons rather than strategic ones. But yeah, it's highly evaluative and subjective.
How do people define it differently? Intentions versus outcomes?
Exactly. Some define it by intentions. It's humanitarian if the main motivation is preventing harm to others, even if other motives are mixed in. Others define it by outcomes. It's only humanitarian if it actually results in a net improvement, reduces suffering, a higher bar.
The 1990s are often called the golden age of this kind of intervention. Why then?
The end of the Cold War seemed to promise this new era of liberal peace based on shared international norms. There was this strong belief that in a global age, states couldn't just limit their moral responsibilities to their own people.
But this raises two big questions. Why did so many humanitarian emergencies suddenly seem to pop up? And why were other states suddenly more willing to intervene?
Good questions. The post-Cold War optimism was quickly punctured by rising disorder in these zones of turmoil. Why the turmoil? Two main explanations get offered.
Internal factor.
Right. Dictatorial government, corruption, economic backwardness, ethnic rivalries. This view often suggests intervention is needed to save the pre-modern world from itself.
But there are external factors too.
Absolutely. The legacy of colonialism, strains from economic globalization, the impact of structural adjustment programs from the IMF, World Bank. If these external factors are significant, then maybe military intervention isn't the right solution at all.
Okay, but states did intervene more in the 90s. Why the increased willingness? Four key factors.
Yes, four factors help explain it. First, as realists love to point out, humanitarian motives often overlap neatly with national interests. Motives are almost always mixed.
Examples.
U.S. intervention in Haiti in 1994 was partly about stopping refugees heading to the U.S. NATO in Kosovo in 99 was partly about avoiding a refugee crisis and regional instability. States are still reluctant to commit troops unless some national interest is at stake.
Second factor, the media.
The CNN effect, yeah. 204/7 News, global TV, instant communications. It created immense public pressure on governments to do something when horrific images were broadcast, especially after non-interventions like Rwanda and Srebrenica caused widespread outrage. Harder to ignore.
Third, the end of the Cold War power balance.
Exactly. The U.S. emerged as the sole superpower. Building consensus for intervention among major powers became much easier. Russia was grappling with the Soviet collapse. China was focused internally. They were less likely to block U.S.-led initiatives.
And the fourth factor, a shift in norms.
Yes. With high hopes for a new world order, politicians and policymakers were more willing to accept that human rights doctrine provided actual standards for ethical conduct. People like Kofi Annan, Clinton, Blair started accepting that rights provided a basis for a right to intervene.
Constructivists call this.
Social influence plus internalization of new norms, as Martha Fenmore put it, a glowing belief in our obligation to save other human beings.
And this era saw key interventions. Northern Iraq, 91.
Establishing safe havens for Kurds.
Somalia, 92.
U.S.-led effort to protect humanitarian operations.
Haiti, 94.
U.S. troops restoring order.
Kosovo, 99.
NATO airstrikes, forcing Serb withdrawal. All examples of this increased willingness for a time.
But then the war on terror dramatically shifted perceptions again.
Completely. Before 2001, the feeling was often too few interventions. Rwanda, Bosnia staining the conscience. After 2001, the feeling became too many because the controversial wars in Afghanistan and Iraq were partly justified on humanitarian grounds.
But they weren't purely humanitarian interventions.
Not strictly speaking, no. Self-defense was the primary justification preventing future 9/11s, not future Rwandas. But supporters definitely portrayed them as humanitarian ventures, too.
How?
In Afghanistan, highlighting the Taliban's brutal regime, especially its treatment of women. In Iraq, focusing on Saddam Hussein's regime as a threat to Kurds and Shia populations. Regime change was explicitly promised to bring human rights and democracy.
So the war on terror effectively broadened the idea of intervention.
It did, but arguably also contaminated it. In the 90s, HI had limited goals. Restore peace, deploy relief. It wasn't about restructuring whole societies.
But Afghanistan and Iraq linked it to liberal interventionism.
Exactly. This larger project assumes liberal values. Market economies, liberal democracy, are universal and superior. And that established liberal states have a right, even a duty, to support populations blocked by repressive governments using diplomacy, sanctions, or military force.
So the goal became regime change, democracy promotion, overlapping with neoconservatism.
Significant overlap, yes. Much broader goals than just humanitarian relief.
And this association with the war on terror created serious problems for the whole idea of humanitarian or liberal intervention.
Huge problems. Firstly, many argued the human rights rationale was just window dressing. Despite the Taliban's and Saddam's records, there wasn't really an imminent threat of genocidal massacres like in Rwanda. Radical critics claimed it was really about U.S. hegemony, oil supplies.
Second problem, the interventions themselves.
They proved far more difficult than expected, turning into protracted, bloody counterinsurgency struggles. This highlighted the danger of getting bogged down, especially as domestic support weakens due to the body bag effect, casualties mounting.
And thirdly, it questioned the universalist assumptions.
Deeply. Doubts grew about imposing Western-style democracy from above. These wars also deepened tensions between the West and the Islamic world. And if liberal values aren't universal, how do you establish consistent standards for intervention based on morality? It becomes very difficult.
These problems help explain why mobilizing support for intervention has been much harder since 2001, leading to non-interventions.
Absolutely. Look at the examples. Darfur since 2004. Hundreds of thousands dead, millions displaced. But concerted intervention blocked by China, Russia, U.S. war fatigue, UN lack of resources or will, left to a small African Union force.
Zimbabwe.
2000s, Mugabe regime, economic collapse, repression. But Western intervention seen as neocolonialism opposed by South Africa.
Burma's
Gross abuses since '88, a pariah state, but not seen as a regional threat, and China opposed Western action.
and Syria.
From 2011, peaceful protests devolved into one of the bloodiest conflicts of the century. Chemical weapons used, millions displaced, yet the world largely stood on the sidelines. Security Council paralyzed.
So in that context, the 2011 NATO intervention in Libya really came as a surprise.
A genuine surprise. It immediately raised the question, was this an aberration, a one-off, due to specific circumstances, or did it mark some kind of revival?
Let's dive into that Libya intervention in 2011. What actually happened?
Okay, March 19th, 2011. A U.S.-led coalition starts air and missile strikes against Gaddafi's forces. This was amidst an emerging civil war, particularly as his troops advanced on the rebel stronghold Benghazi, threatening, as Obama said, violence on a horrific scale.
Under UN authority.
Yes, based on UN Security Council resolutions 1970 and 1973. They enforced an arms embargo, set up a no-fly zone, and authorized all necessary measures to protect civilians. NATO took over command within days.
What was the effect of the intervention?
It effectively neutralized Libya's air force, severely reduced Gaddafi's heavy weapons capability. It arguably tipped the conflict decisively in favor of the opposition. By early October, the National Transitional Council controlled the country. Gaddafi was captured and killed. NATO ended its operation end of October after 222 days.
And its significance. The first tied explicitly to R2P.
That's right. The responsibility to protect concept, it really forced the question, revival or aberration. Many thought the HI era was over, post-Cold War conditions gone, U.S. appetite diminished after Iraq-Afghanistan, rise of Russia-China. Libya showed it could still happen.
But the motivations, as always, were controversial.
Highly. Obama, Sarkozy, Cameron invoked humanitarian principles. Critics pointed to oil, economic interests, maybe supported by Hillary Clinton's visit just before Gaddafi's death, focusing on business ties, integrating Libya into global markets. Always mixed motives, it seems.
What factors made intervention feasible in Libya specifically?
Several things lined up. First, a sound legal basis. UN Security Council authorization plus regional backing from the Arab League, Gulf Cooperation Council. This was possible because Gaddafi's Libya had few powerful friends, no close ties to veto-wielding Russia or China. He was isolated.
Military feasibility.
Relatively weak air defenses, emphasis on airstrikes kept NATO casualties minimal, actually zero. Crucially, avoided boots on the ground, which is always politically toxic domestically.
And initial assessments were optimistic.
Yes, initial military and political assessments were hopeful about the likely outcomes, perhaps overly so.
Because that optimism faded fast, didn't it?
Very fast. By 2014, Libya was plunged into a second civil war. What was hailed as averting a protracted war instead arguably enabled it by shattering the existing state structure without a clear plan for what came next.
And the unintended consequences continued. The refugee detention centers.
A truly tragic outcome. Following a deal with the EU to reduce migration, these centers, operating outside the rule of law in a war zone, became notorious. Overcrowded, evidence mounting of malnutrition, rape, torture, murder. The UN demanded their closure in 2019, a disastrous legacy.
So, given these complexities, the unintended consequences, it brings us back to the ultimate question. When, if ever, is humanitarian intervention truly justifiable?
It forces us to extend just war theory in really bold, challenging ways. The moral hurdles are significant.
Like violating non-intervention.
Right. It breaches that established norm of inviolable borders, conflicts with state sovereignty, potentially threatens world order if used recklessly.
And it goes beyond self-defense.
Yes, force is justified to defend others, saving strangers. That's rooted in cosmopolitan ethics, allowing states to risk their own soldiers' lives for people in other countries. big ask.
Plus, it assumes universal standards.
It assumes universal human rights standards, potentially ignoring ethical pluralism, diverse religious and cultural frameworks around the world.
And it might even downgrade last resort.
Potentially. Faced with imminent genocide, waiting to exhaust all nonviolent options might seem morally indefensible. Force could become a first resort in extreme cases.
So given all that, intervention must be exceptional, extraordinary.
Absolutely. To prevent it becoming a new form of imperialism, cloaking expansionist ambitions in moral language, clear guidelines are essential.
Two key issues usually get debated: just cause and right authority.
Exactly. What warrants intervention and who gets to decide?
For just cause, just saying human rights violation is too broad.
Way too broad. The UDHR has 29 articles. That would legitimize intervention constantly. Crimes against humanity from the Nuremberg trials is a better guide.
But the most widely used justification is genocide, the crime of crimes.
It is. Defined by the UN's 1948 Genocide Convention. Killing, harm, destruction, preventing births, transferring children with intent to destroy a group. But even genocide is tricky. Proving genocidal intent can be very difficult legally, while many large-scale killings happen without clear, provable intent.
This is where R2P tried to offer clearer criteria, that 2000 report.
Yes, the International Commission on Intervention in State Sovereignty, ICS, report, probably the most thorough attempt to set principles.
What were its two specific criteria for military action?
Okay, R2P says military action is justified by, first, large-scale loss of life, actual or apprehended, with or without genocidal intent due to state action, neglect, inability to act, or a failed state.
So intent isn't the only factor for mass killing.
Right. And second, large-scale ethnic cleansing, actual or apprehended, carried out by killing, expulsion, terror, or rape.
What's the advantage of these criteria?
They're more specific than just crimes against humanity, and crucially, they allow intervention for large-scale loss of life, not from deliberate human action like mass starvation, because a state is simply unable to help its people. It broadens the scope beyond just evil intent.
Okay, so once you have a potential just cause, who has the right authority to authorize intervention?
The generally accepted answer is the UN Security Council. Because of its role in international law, its responsibility for international peace and security.
But there are problems with relying solely on the Security Council.
Two big difficulties. First, the legal ambiguity we mentioned. International law on HI is fuzzy, somewhere between prohibition in the UN Charter and acceptance in customary law. This ambiguity around sovereignty led supporters to push the idea of responsible sovereignty.
The idea that sovereignty is conditional.
Exactly. Kofi Annan argued the state should be the servant of its people. R2P emphasizes sovereignty includes a responsibility to protect citizens. If a state fails, that responsibility potentially shifts. Sovereignty isn't absolute permission to do whatever you want internally.
And the second difficulty with the Security Council.
The veto power. The 5 permanent members, P5, might prioritize their own global power interests over genuine humanitarian concerns. They can block action for strategic reasons, regardless of the facts on the ground.
So R2P allows alternatives if the UNSC fails to act.
It does. It suggests alternatives like the UN General Assembly meeting in an emergency special session, or action by regional, sub-regional organizations. In practice, NATO has often been the actor Kosovo, Afghanistan, Libya, sometimes with, sometimes without explicit UNSC approval. Controversial.
So the bottom line question, does humanitarian intervention actually work? Do the benefits outweigh the costs? Does it save lives?
That's the incredibly difficult question. Judging it objectively is almost impossible because you're comparing actual outcomes with hypothetical ones, what would have happened without intervention. You can never definitively prove, say, that earlier intervention in Rwanda would have saved X number of lives.
Despite that difficulty, there are examples where intervention seems to have produced positive outcomes.
Certainly. The no-fly zone in northern Iraq in '91 did prevent reprisals and allowed Kurdish autonomy to develop. Kosovo '99 did expel Serbian forces, ended mass displacement. Sierra Leone intervention ended a brutal civil war, led to elections. There are successes.
But plenty of failures or mixed results, too.
Absolutely. UN peacekeepers sidelined in catastrophes like the DRC. Interventions abandoned as unsuccessful, like Somalia, or resulting in protracted, bloody struggles like Afghanistan and Iraq.
And the deepest problem, as realists warn, is those unintended consequences.
Yeah.
Doing more harm than good.
That's the constant risk. Look at Libya again. Hailed initially, but by 2014, new civil war, ISIS presence, the horrific refugee detention centers, a disaster stemming partly from the intervention itself and the lack of follow-through.
Which underlines that intervention shouldn't be a knee-jerk reaction.
Precisely. Many interventions fail due to inadequate planning for reconstruction, insufficient resources for rebuilding after the fighting stops.
That's why R2P emphasizes more than just intervention.
Yes, it stresses the broader responsibility to prevent crises in the first place and the responsibility to rebuild afterwards, linking intervention directly to peace-building and nation-building efforts. It has to be part of a bigger strategy.
It's clear why humanitarian intervention remains so hotly disputed. Some see it as enlightened cosmopolitanism, others as deeply misguided.
Exactly. Let's lay out the arguments for intervention, the yes, it's justified side.
Go ahead.
First, the idea of indivisible humanity. We share a common humanity, implying moral responsibilities beyond borders and obligation to save strangers. Second, global interdependence. Events elsewhere affect us, refugee crises, instability giving an incentive based on enlightened self-interest. Third, regional stability. Humanitarian emergencies often destabilize whole regions, incentivizing neighbors to support intervention.
What else? Democracy promotion.
Yes, interventions often occur in dictatorships. Promoting democracy is seen as a legitimate long-term goal to strengthen human rights. Finally, demonstrating commitment to shared values, peace, human rights strengthens the international community, reinforces that rule-bound global order, embodies responsible sovereignty.
Okay, now the arguments against intervention, the no, it's problematic or not justified side.
Primary argument: it violates international law. The UN Charter only clearly allows intervention in self-defense. Respecting sovereignty is seen as the surest way to uphold order. Permitting HI confuses the rules, weakens order.
The realist critique. National interests always rule.
Right. States are always self-interested. Humanitarian claims are often just political mendacity, a cover. Truly, humanitarian intervention would mean risking your own citizens for strangers, violating the national interest. Unlikely, they say.
What about double standards?
A huge issue. Many emergencies are ignored, Chechnya, Tibet, because no national interest is involved, not enough media, politically impossible. This inconsistency makes the whole doctrine seem hopelessly confused, arbitrary.
And the politics are too simplistic. Good versus evil.
Critics argue the case for intervention often relies on the simplistic narrative, exaggerating atrocities, ignoring moral complexities on the ground. This leads to mission drift, unintended negative consequences when reality proves more complex.
Finally, moral pluralism again, cultural imperialism.
Yes. Intervention is seen as imposing Western human rights notions which aren't universally applicable. Historical, cultural, religious differences make achieving a truly universal just cause threshold impossible, they argue.
So it boils down to this fundamental tension.
Exactly. How do you balance that powerful human urge to prevent suffering with the equally important principles of state sovereignty, cultural diversity, and the hard realities of international power politics? There are no easy answers.
And so as we wrap up this deep dive, we're left with a really nuanced picture, aren't we? We've tracked the evolution of human rights, explored the complex international regime meant to protect them, UN, NGOs, the paradoxical role of states.
We've unpacked the serious philosophical and political critiques challenging universalism.
And grappled with the contentious history, the uncertain future of humanitarian intervention, its rise, its fall, its deeply contested justifications, and those sobering unintended consequences like Libya.
It really leaves us with some critical questions, doesn't it? Can a truly universal set of human rights actually exist and function in a world with such diverse cultures, such conflicting values?
And when we are faced with grave atrocities, what is our collective responsibility as an international community? Who really has the authority to act, given all the complexities, the risks, the power politics?
That's profound.
Here's a final thought to leave you with. If sovereignty is truly about a state's responsibility to protect its own people, then when a state fails that most fundamental duty, does the international community not just have a right, but perhaps a moral imperative to step in? And critically, at what cost?
We hope this deep dive has given you the tools to think through these profound tensions. They will undoubtedly continue to shape global politics for decades to come, and how you understand them really informs your view of the world.